attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to our webinar. This is Michelle Smith. I am the director for the Southern Obesity Summit, the largest regional obesity prevention summit in the U.S. And we've been going on, this is our 9th one. We're real excited this year. We've got a great lineup. If you're interested in finding out more, you can see the agenda, registration at southernobesitysummit.org. You can follow us on Twitter at Southern Obesity, or we have a special hashtag for the summit itself where we'll be posting things as we get closer and during the actual summit. So leading up to the summit, which is focusing on policy, we thought we would share. I met these wonderful people from Influence Opinions who presented at a meeting for the Public Health Coalition here in Texas and shared some startling information for me on the impact of social media on the last legislative session here in Texas. And I felt like this was a really good way to get some information to our attendees in advance of the summit, where we will be focusing on policy and the impacts and how to more effectively use policy. So this morning we have invited Elise Yates to join us, and she will be presenting. Just real quickly, just the logistics. I'm sure probably most of you have been on these webinars before, and everyone is muted. If you would like to submit a question, there is a place right there on your desktop that you should be able to enter questions, and we will have time for questions at the end. We are recording this, and we'll post a link so that you can see the webinar or share the webinar with other people that you feel would be interested in this. So with that, Elisa is the founder and CEO of Influence Opinions. She has more than 2 decades of experience and expertise in areas as diverse as politics, high tech, public affairs, nonprofits, and entertainment, not to mention clear big picture vision, incredible insight, and strategies that work. She is driven by a natural inquisitiveness and genuine interest in people, media, and messaging, and that will definitely show through. Prior to launching the firm Influence Opinions, Elise was the managing director for Public Strategies, Inc., which is a recognized leader in public perception management for Fortune 500 companies. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to turn this over to Elise. And let's see, where are you, Elise?
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I've got a presentation that I'll be walking through, and I believe that we can see questions. So if I get into something, just in a little bit of housekeeping, that I am talking in too many acronyms or terms that people who are real familiar with social media might understand, but that is harder for others to keep up with, then let us know. We're trying to get my screen to.
I see your screen, but it's your desktop.
I see my screen, and then now we're getting it into the play mode. There we go. I was in the. Okay,
there you are.
There we go. We're going to be, I'm going to be doing an overview of, can you see, just very quickly on my screen, can you see where we've got the GoToWebinar control panel? Is it over?
No, I can't see that, but you're in presenter mode. So I'm seeing.
Excellent. Okay. I just wanted to be sure that it wasn't a literal screen, because then you don't
No, it's not.
Part of it. So yeah, I am the founder and CEO of Influence Opinions, and we focus on digital and public affairs. Some information about us there. And I'm going to be talking today about the intersection of policy and social media, because it is its own specific area. three things that I want to highlight now, and I'll talk about as we go. One is that social media really has changed the way that elected officials communicate with the public, because it is both a way for them to communicate to their constituents and a way for the constituents to communicate directly back to them in a format that others can see. And that because the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., are free for everybody to use, it has actually lowered the bar for the cost of engaging with the public like this, and that even really small organizations with very minimal budgets have an opportunity to leverage the tools because they are free. So we'll be going through
you're in presenter mode. They're seeing this
screen,
not that screen. Go back to this.
Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Or there you go, yeah.
Okay, here we go. So to give some background on where we are with social media, we've gotten to the point where social media has become one of the main activities of Americans online. A whopping 302 million monthly users on Twitter, with 500 million tweets per day, 1.5 billion monthly active users on Facebook, and the average American now spends 40 minutes a day on Facebook, which I do this stuff for a living, and that number still blows my mind because it is indicative of how much the public has embraced social media as a way to communicate. And now we've reached a pinnacle just this year where as many Americans say that they get their news from Facebook as traditional TV news, which has historically been the #1 place for people to get their news. The other one, YouTube, is billion monthly active users, and with 300 hours of video uploaded every minute. The other thing about YouTube that's interesting is it has now become the second biggest search engine in the world after Google, because it has become a go-to place for people to look for information. And then Instagram, which is part of Facebook, owns it, although it's its own thing as well. 300 million monthly active users there. And this popularity and embracing of these tools has translated to legislators as well. We are going to be talking about Texas because Texas is the state that we did the last survey in. But I will say that we've seen the kind of statistics for usages in other states among legislators and the public as we do in Texas. In fact, a news study just came out last week that showed that at the federal level, legislators are using social media at the same level that we see here in Texas. So between 2011, 2013, and 2015, we tracked the percentage of Texas legislators that were on specifically Twitter. And as you can see, from 2011 to 2013, we had a jump from 56% to 76%, and then again all the way up to 91%. So by the end of the last Texas legislative session, 91% of legislators were on Twitter. We talk about Twitter a lot because it is, while it is not the most popular social media platform for the general public, it is the social media platform that is the most used by people engaged in public policy. Reporters use it, the legislators use it, staffers use it, lobbyists use it, And because they're all on it, then third parties and others who are interested in public policy are on it as well. I believe that the reason for that is because Twitter is still in real time, unlike other platforms that use algorithms to present information in the way that they think that the user wants to see it. Twitter still presents it for the most part in as the tweets are posted. So it means that if there's a policy debate going on, then the conversation on Twitter is literally happening in real time. And that makes it a great pathway to see how the conversation is being framed. The other thing that we saw during this last legislative session is that the number of tweets sent had doubled. The number of tweets sent by legislators more than doubled between 2013 and 2015. And that system of legislators embracing the tool and then using the tool has also led to an increase in people following legislators. And this slide where you see that red is in 2013 and numbers and green is the 2015 numbers, that the people following senators, Texas state senators in 2013 was a third of the number that followed them in 2015. And we saw a substantial increase in the House as well. It wasn't as dramatic as it was in the Senate, but still very dramatic. And so putting those things together, the adoption rate by the legislators coupled with the use, once they do adopt it, of the tool, then leads to more people engaging with them, which then leads to them using the tool more, which then leads to more people engaging with them. So it's a self-referential circle in the adoption of the tools. And it really has become when we occasionally have conversations with the legislators or their staff about their usage and how they value it and what they do with the tools. And state senator's chief of staff told me that she keeps a tab open on her computer that shows what is going on Twitter as it relates to the issues she cares about and her legislator, because it gives her a couple of hours head start in seeing what issues are getting talked about and what kind of framing they are being talked about with, so that she can prepare her staff and her elected official to be ready to talk about it with their constituents or with the media. This ability to communicate directly with legislators is another reason that social media has been adopted by the influencers and by third parties. These are some examples of where we saw people commenting directly to a legislator, and in some cases, as you see here, getting a reply back. Another thing that we saw, I don't have the screenshot of it, but during a big legislative fight where there were issues happening that were related to how people could to the process. So we had a legislator who was trying to get something killed by using rules. And we saw that people who understood the rules from other that were not in the building, they were not on the floor, they were watching the fight happen, started tweeting in where the legislator should look in the rule books in order to help his case. And the legislator used it, found it, used it, and did it. And that's just a microcosm of the kinds of things that you can see in real time. One lobbyist friend of mine was talking to me about what has happened here is that the lobby used to be literally the closest to the floor as the legislators were debating. And now, because the lobbyists obviously cannot physically walk onto the floor, but you can tweet directly to a legislator or to a staffer who's supporting that legislator, that it brings down a barrier, a physical barrier that used to be there for those that engage with the tools. Texas last year, again, just looking at the amount of activity that we saw 304 mentions of the hashtag that is used when people in Texas talk about legislative issues. And the hashtag, for those who are somewhat new to this, is where you see the pound sign. When I was growing up, we called it a pound sign. It got renamed as a hashtag, where you get the pound sign and then a series of letters that tag tweets, tag content, so that people who are interested in that specific content can find it. One of the things that we saw during this last legislative session too was that there is a ebb and flow to how issues are discussed. We saw that in the beginning, when the legislators first came to town and started the session, that the content of what was being talked about was primarily focused on thank you and back patting other people, I'm so honored to be here, etc., as well as the beginning of committee assignments. And then as the session continued, it moved into priorities, and we started seeing roundup stories and stories and tweets about legislative priorities, and then how the budget was likely to be used, or what the fights around the budget were going to be. But it was still pretty broad. And then as the session moved on, it became very specific. So the third season, if you will, of it was bill numbers and comments about committee votes. There was a lot of focus on logistics. So tactical legislative issues. How is this going to happen? Do we have enough time to get this passed? Will this piece of legislation be able to get out of committee? And then at the end, it focused on the tactics of trying to kill something, or whether or not there was a belief that something was going to be vetoed or not. And then in each one of these times, people were able, third parties, interested constituencies were able to tailor their activity on social media to match up with the conversations that were being had at those points. Here's some examples of the kinds of content that we saw along that continuum. Again, with number one being the thank you, glad to be back, ready to work. Number two being conversations about specific funding, though not with a bill yet, but in general. And then third was very specifically bill numbers and causes and timelines. And then four was the very end of the session, when a lot of it was tactical wrangling. And we laid this out because we found that our clients were better able to engage when they knew what kind of engagement the legislators were going to be participating in. What were they looking for? What kind of support or what kind of conversation they would be engaged in. We could tailor our content to meet up with where the legislator was taking the conversation. Another thing that we do with our clients and that we suggest organizations that have legislative or regulatory agendas that they are using social media tools to discuss and educate is to see what kind of conversation is happening that legislators are engaging in. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. At the end of this, we'll be giving you a list of tools that will allow you to do some of the things that we're showing today, and this being able to pull the content from a legislator and then putting it into a word cloud so you can see what they're talking about is one of those things that you can do for very minimal, with very minimal resources. And the way that we use this is a word cloud that is a representation of the language used in tweets from legislative offices, that each word represents a word that was used repeatedly. The bigger the word, the more often it was used. This is a broad brush of what we saw. It was everything that every legislator talked about. But when we're working with a client, we can get much more specific, as can you, in looking at it. So if we knew that there were legislators that had a particularly important role in us getting our legislation passed, or that we needed to go meet with them and we wanted to know what it was that they were paying attention to and spending their time talking about, we could grab the content of their tweet, so a specific legislator, and we could look at what they were talking about, and that way we could engage with them on what was important to them, or we could work to change the conversation around what they cared about. So a really powerful, simple yet powerful tool in being able to align and educate. So with the backdrop of all of this, with how much attention legislative offices are paying to social content, and the types of visibility that you can get by looking at the social media content, wanted to address what are the kinds of things that individual organizations can do to engage, particularly understanding that social is a huge new area and that it can be really easy to get lost in it. As well as we work with a lot of clients who are educating opinion leaders and decision makers rather than straight up advocating or trying to engage in partisan politics. And I used this example. It's a old cartoon about highlighting the ridiculousness of everything on the internet all the time and trying to fight with everybody who is wrong on the internet. But in this situation that a lot of organizations who have a policy perspective are in, is that if there are inaccuracies that are being offered up in the online conversation, it can be really damaging to not address them. So one of the key things that people can do, organizations can do, is to ensure that there is accuracy in what is being talked about. So an example of this would be if there is a conversation going on and there is a story going around that is meant to highlight a part of the issue, but the story is either misleading or is just not true, then the important thing to do would be to provide the facts that are correct so that you're setting the record straight. And then a big piece of it is to be present, to be a source of information that is presenting factual information And the framing around an issue really does matter. This is, I pulled these, we have a perpetual fight in Texas around whether private entities should get public money for education. And we have one, the term voucher has become loaded enough with both the general public and the opinion leaders that it is now seen in a negative light. And there's been a movement to do some of the same things that vouchers would accomplish, but to label it differently in order to not have to carry the baggage of the voucher label. And this is an example of two different people, or one's an organization, one's an elected official, who are framing the concept in two very different ways, though what they're fighting about is the same thing, as well as an article about how important it is to frame a specific bill. So not that a lot of our clients, or that we would advocate that the folks on this call get into the partisan conversation on something like this, but this would be an instance where if you had, if this kind of debate was swirling around an issue that you cared about, and you have good information that helps enlighten the conversation and would be important for people who cared about it to know, that this would be a place to use that in social media content in order to make sure that it is part of the conversation. Another thing is being able to track sentiment, and along the same lines of the framing of the conversation is really important. This is an example of that when we looked at the social media conversation around the Affordable Care Act, and what we saw was that 10% of that conversation would be negative, 41% of it was neutral, and then 49% of it was positive. But when you look at the same conversation around Obamacare, so this was during the same time period, looking at the same channels, that when the term Obamacare was used, those numbers shifted dramatically. And this is to reinforce that the framing really does matter on how an issue is presented. And most of the time you'll know whether your issue is more favorably looked upon one way or another. And then to be able to see through looking at conversations what how the public who are talking about it or who's posting on social media, where it's negative and where it's positive. So in this case, we were clear. We didn't have a client in this. This was something that we did because we were interested in the overall positioning of it. But if we'd had a client who was attached to this issue, we would have told them to talk as often and as loudly as they could about Affordable Care Act, rather than terming it as Obamacare, because the Obamacare conversation was so much more negative. So that's an example of being able to look at how the conversation is tracking and make some decisions on how to engage in it. So I talked a minute ago about hashtags, and this is an example of how hashtags are used, and a way that you can use them to track your own issues. So a hashtag, as I mentioned, was where you use the pound sign, the hashtag sign, and then there is a term that follows it. In this case, it is hashtag TextEd. And when people during the legislative session talked about higher education or K through 12 or pre-K, they would tag the post, and this is true on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, with this hashtag, so that people who were interested in keeping up with that conversation could track it to be able to decide whether to engage in it or not. So one of the tools out there, and again, we're going to give a list of tools that can be used to do some of the things that we're showing on this. One of them is a service called Hootsuite, and you can set up a system so that you can cache all of the content that comes across that has that hashtag attached to it. And the thing that lets you do is it lets you see what the conversation looks like. It lets you see who's engaged in that conversation, so what handles or what people are talking about it. And it lets you then use that hashtag when you want to communicate with the people who are interested in that subject. It's almost like I think of hashtags in this context as an address of a town square where the conversation is being talked about. And one of the things about hashtags that's really helpful is that people don't need to be following you in order to see your content related to that issue, because they can follow the hashtag. So it's a shorthand way to get into the key conversation. Here's an example of how key hashtags were used as it related to specific issues, again, during this last Texas session. Some of these hashtags that you see in this list are bill numbers, like the third from the top, the HB 3994, the HB 4105, SB 11. Those are all specific pieces of legislation. So once the legislation got a number, then people were able to create a conversation on social media specific to that piece of legislation. And again, it helps to be able to track it, to track who's interested in it, and then also to be able to engage in it yourself. The piece that I'm showing here, this is a little harder to do, but it is showing how handles that are talking about a specific issue engage with each other. The way that the algorithms create the social media map is that in this case, again, it was education in Texas, and each dot represents a social media handle. The size of the dot indicates how often they were engaged in the conversation, and then the connections to the dot indicate how many other handles are engaged with that handle. And this gives you the ability to see not just who's involved in the conversation, but how they break out. So on the one community that we see here in the orange is primarily elected officials or reporters who cover the policy aspect of it. The green dots are primarily official organizations involved in education in Texas. So it is the Texas Education Association, it is the education commissioners, it is the Department of Education, et cetera. Then the red are statewide outlets rather than individual reporters that cover it. And then the blue are national organizations that are engaged in the conversation around Texas education. And this lets you see not only who those individuals are, but then how they are specifically engaging in the conversation, so that you have the opportunity to target the ones that have the most in common with you, or the ones that are most attached to the decision makers around your issue. So another piece is to stay current on what options there are out there to engage the social media tools. These are some examples of Instagram. And 2 years ago, Instagram was not a platform that we saw much activity on dealing with policy fights. But over the last about year and a half, it has really increased as a channel. And one of the key elements of Instagram is that it uses a lot of hashtags, which again are easy to search. It's easy to find the conversation around the issues that you care about. Instagram is very heavily visual. It is actually a platform to post photos with the content that gets posted with them, as well as the hashtags being somewhat secondary. So again, a couple of years ago, it was more prom pictures and nice dinners and art projects than it was the political. But as the political realm, as it's gotten more and more popular, the political realm has gotten more and more savvy about how to use it. One of the big opportunities with social media is to find your friends and get them to engage in your visibly supporting your issue. This can be done in a number of ways. It can be done by sending out a request through your channels, both social media and more traditional like email newsletters, to ask people to visibly take an action. Up at the left-hand part of the screen, you see call an action alert that's requesting that people call their lawmakers. If you had clicked on the link at the bottom of that tweet, it would take you to a place where you could find your lawmakers' contact information based on where you are. That was done, this particular campaign was done both on social and through email newsletters, as well as calls to action in more traditional ways like phone trees. Another, the Hays County Water Facts, the big one on the right-hand side of the page, is an example of posting a petition online to ask people to show their support. And petitions are a great tool to engage folks. Not only do they collect the contact information of the people who sign up and then deliver them that information to the legislators, but they also provide you with a list of people who were interested in your issue to sign a petition. And in most cases, when they sign the petition, they also give you permission to continue to communicate with them. And the petition infrastructure has gotten a whole lot easier with things like Care2 and Change.org. And these are services that have a really robust offering that the baseline of it is free. So again, back to the point that the cost to use these tools is minimal, and that it brings some powerful opportunities to organizations that used to not be able to access them just because of cost. And that's been we've seen this really make a difference for a lot of our clients with low budgets. The last one on this page, the action alert, the bottom of the left-hand screen, this is one that was put out over Instagram that was also done as a text campaign, and on this particular one, they clearly paid for it, though the cost to reach particular audiences on these tools is pretty low, but I wanted to show it as an example as well. Another thing that we saw really take off over this last session is Facebook. And Facebook has always been a great platform for talking to like-minded people. But it had historically not been particularly valuable in talking to legislators. And over the last year, they have done an amazing job of making their tools be very targeted. And so the example that I've pulled up here is that Facebook, this is a Facebook ad tool. And you can now do Facebook ads. You can do $5 on a Facebook ad and still get targeted communications. In this case, what we were doing is we had overlaid a Senate district, and we did that simply by using zip codes within that Senate district. And then targeting our communications to the demographic within that Senate district that we knew to be the most likely to want to engage in our issue. In this particular case, it was children's hospitals. It was support for children's hospitals. And so this Senate district was the home district of a legislator who had a position on a committee that was really important to us. And this allowed us to contact and create a conversation with people in his district who cared about children's hospitals. And then leverage that by asking them to contact this legislator directly, so that the legislator was aware of the support for our issue within his own district. Having done this for a really long time, the cost to do something like this before the advent of the social media tools would have been in the tens of thousands at the very minimum, and probably closer to the hundreds of thousands. And now, because the platforms are there and you're not having to reach them only by using direct mail or paid advertising or block walkers, which was pretty much our options 10 years ago, that because they are choosing to spend their time on social media, you can now engage with them directly in ways that cost to nothing. And the democratization of being able to engage in conversations with legislators and with their supporters is one of the big positives that has come out of social media from my perspective, and something that you can definitely take advantage of. Another thing on the Facebook ad precise targeting that we use is we're also able to look at a particular demographic and see how many people are there. This is a free opportunity just to be able to see how many people are engaged in children's issues or engaged in public health or engaged in marathons, whatever you might be looking at. And so in some ways this provides an opportunity for really cheap person research. Another thing that this is an opportunity to be able to tell whether an audience or a community is engaged what they're thinking about is geotargeted listening. The firm that we use for this is a company called Geopedia, and we're able to identify a specific geography and see what kind of social media conversation is coming out of that geography. And there's options that are inexpensive and then options that cost a little bit more money, but we have found this to be particularly useful for small organizations that are targeting very specific issues, such as yours. There's also the opportunity to advertise where influencers are. If you know that there is a particular blog or a newsletter or a part of a news outlet that has a lot of the people that are going to care about your issue, the cost to advertise in those places is pretty minimal. This is an example of a boosted Facebook post where, again, you can pay money to get your post in front of very specific people in very specific places. I think that we spent maybe on the order of $50 to get it in front of 12,000 people. So while it is paid, it's pretty minimal. Here are some examples of some Facebook advertising, which is also you can do it for really minimal budgets that were helpful to us. And I think that we wanted to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to wrap up this particular piece of it, but did want to reiterate some key elements. And one is that these tools and these platforms have become a place where you can really get the attention and engage in a conversation with key decision makers, and that the price of them have come down to the point where they're using these tools. Either you're leveraging the free part of them to engage in a conversation by using hashtags, et cetera, or you are using the very inexpensive things like boosted post. And then the third is that even though it can sometimes seem like social media is so big and so overwhelming, that there are real specific ways to get involved with it that make it targeted to what you're doing, specifically doing. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Okay, so the first one, is it the legislator answering or tweeting, or is it their staff? And is there any way to know? So the short answer is that it's often both. It's often you'll get where a legislator does some amount of monitoring and responding on their own, but they tend to try to cover their outlets 24/7, and so that also takes staff time. You get some legislators that just don't touch it at all, but even those legislators will be asking the staffer who is engaged with it, what are we seeing, what kind of response are we getting? And next question, how do you share info in 40 characters or less? So there's a couple of things that you can do there, because this is Twitter specifically limits your characters to 40. And one of the things that you do is you can put links in it, and you can shorten the link. And one of the main opportunities with it is that it's a way to direct people to longer form content. So you might use your 40 characters to give a description of what the link is to, rather than trying to get a whole press release or a whole statement in that. Using visuals in Twitter, whether it is GIF or just a photo. If you embed a photo within the tweet, that doesn't count against your characters. So that's another way to do it. It's great, obviously, just like everything else. If you've got a creative headline, if it can be funny or it can be outrage, that you're going to get more engagement with that. And then calls to action are always a great way to do it. If you're asking, let your legislator know, or stand up now, those kinds of things get a high amount of engagement. So, who establishes a hashtag, and how do you know if it's a legit? This is such an interesting question. So the deal with hashtags is that they are the Wild West. Hashtags can't be trademarked. They can't be owned by anybody. And so it is completely acceptable to see a hashtag that's getting used that you think is connected to your issue in some way, and to just start using it. You do have to, in some cases, we've seen hashtags that have where it's most often been part of a marketing push, and you have somebody like McDonald's did this last year, and where they came up with a hashtag, and they wanted people to use the hashtag and tweet about why they liked eating at McDonald's. And instead what happened is people started using the hashtag and calling McDonald's out on everything from the quality of its product to how much they paid people. But, I mean, there's been some pretty big and in some cases funny places where a marketing push to use a specific hashtag went off the rails. But for the kinds of issues that the folks on this call are likely to be engaged in, the chances of that are pretty low. So one of the things is looking for a hashtag to see if there are ones that are already being used that you can start to fold into your content, or if you can come up with a cool one that you want to use around your issue. But anybody can use them. You can use any hashtag that's out there. Anybody else can use a hashtag that you put out there. And so the legitimacy of it really relates to who's using it and how is it being used. If it gets much play, then it will come to the attention of whether it's reporters or it's legislators who care about the issue. So it's, as much as anything, it's about the volume that you're able to produce around it. So one of the things that I want to reiterate, I don't think I've touched on this yet, but is that in the public affairs arena, you don't have to have a whole lot of traffic around an issue in order for it to be visible. It's not the same as it would be if this was a conversation around a band or around a TV show or around the Super Bowl. Legislative, regulatory, policy issues, while they are heavily talked about by the influencers, that influencer group is just not very big. So they're very, very important in being able to make real-world decisions, but the numbers are not that big. So another very good question, what about lobbying rules, especially for organizations that may partner with or be hosted by other institutions like universities? Really, really good question. So the difference between education and advocacy, you can use the tools to educate all the time on anything. So it would be the difference between seeing a Twitter conversation or a social media conversation break out that's surrounding, say, whether or not soda machines should be allowed on school campuses. And whether you engage in that conversation saying straight up, no, they shouldn't be, or here's why they're bad, or tell your legislature they're bad. The difference between that and saying, here is the statistics about the decrease in overall sugar consumption when kids don't have access to sodas. Or here is the data around the cost of obesity for school children. So getting into the conversation, but doing it in a way with what you're presenting as facts, and not putting a call to action around it, not putting a campaign or advocacy frame around it. You can also look for subgroups that aren't bound by the same, if there are people in your coalition or partners that you have that are not in this situation, and ask them to carry information that is more, got a more advocacy call to action bent to it. The other thing is that the leaders of your organizations, for instance, a university, the leaders can frame an issue without having to advocate one way or another because they carry legitimacy in the conversation. So they're looked upon as organizations that have a depth of knowledge and expertise that automatically carries weight. So this makes it a good platform even if you're not straight up advocating. Engage in alumni groups is another way to frame the issue that may or may not, I mean, obviously always doing it within the bounds of what is legal, but looking for partners that are in different situations. And I think that, yep, we are wrapping up. We're going to get this last sheet out that has the access to the tools that we talked about. The ones at the top are free, and the ones at the bottom cost more. I hope that this was helpful. I'm glad to have gotten an opportunity to talk to y'all.
Thank you so much. I'm always impressed and amazed at where our social media are taking us, and to have you share your experience and your resources with us is fabulous. I hope everyone has learned something that you'll find useful, and thank you guys for joining us today. We will be posting the recording and information on the Southern Obesity Summit website, and I'll also send all of those who registered a link so that you can go directly to the video. It is top of the hour, and have a great rest of the day.